So welcome to our research seminar for the spring semester, and thank you for being here in person. My name is Shini Wu. I will be hosting the seminar for this semester. And our first speaker today is Dr. Castro, and he has very impressive title, so let me just read them out. So Dr. Castro is professor of our school, and he also the director of military and veterans programs. He also directs the Center for Innovation and Research on Veterans and Military Families. And this part, I didn't know you direct the RAN USC Epstein Family Foundation Center for Veterans Policy Research as well, which is no new stuff. So today, Dr. Castro is going to talk to this very important topic, which is suicidal prevention. And he's going to summarize what we know and what we think we know. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Castro. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank everyone who's here in person and online. Just so as an overview, I plan to talk for about 40 minutes and then open it up for questions and answers or comments or rebuttals. Because my goal here is to really present some thought-provoking ideas, and I will try to make it very clear when it's an idea versus it's what the science says. Okay, and so I'll try to be very deliberate there. But if I slip up and don't make that point, please feel free to jump in and correct me. And I know that some of the students who are on the line will not even hesitate to do that. So that's the goal. So I'm going to talk about suicide prevention. Here's my outline for those of you who are in the military. You know, every military talk begins with an outline, which this is what I'm going to tell you, that I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you at the end. Although we may skip that last part if I'm running behind schedule. This method, by the way, of telling what you're going to tell them what you told them, was developed in academia. The military reached out to universities and said, what's the best way to instruct people? And they say, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So I will try to do that, but not in sort of a belittling way. So I'm going to present some data on suicides, primarily among veterans and active duty folks. But for those of you who study suicides among non-military populations or other different types of populations, be thinking about the translation, because culture is really, really important in suicide prevention, I would argue. And I'm not going to go through every culture, but I want those of you who work with these other populations to really be thinking about that. Then I'm going to describe some approaches that we use, and I'll be very critical here. So this is where you'll be, oh my gosh. And then I'll talk about some of the risk factors, but then I'm going to demonstrate that most suicides can be linked to perceived personal failure or obligation that threatens one's sense of self. And I will argue that that's where we should change and focus. And maybe say, well, why should we change and focus? Hopefully I'll make that point very clear. So here is some data. The most recently publicly official suicide data from the Department of Veterans Affairs. And you can see it goes up to 2022, was published in a report that came out in 2024, which wasn't released until 2025, all right? So that's the lag time for a lot of the data that we use, okay? But you can see this bottom graph here where it says veterans, the light blue. It looks like a pretty flat line, doesn't it? Looks like, hey, hasn't really changed in 2 decades, from 2001 to 2022. And then you can see the top line is non-military population. Looks like, oh my goodness, it's getting worse, right? Everyone kind of see that? Keep in mind, this is number of suicides. It's not suicide rate, all right? Now, the slide on my left, your right, looking at the screen, is this light blue line blown up. And you can see it looks like it's gone up and it hops around and fluctuates. Now, I put a couple of bullets down below because this is important, especially for those of you who like statistics. The science of social work students should really resonate with this. So nearly 600,000 veterans die every year of all causes. Okay, so, but only about 200,000 service member becomes veterans. Does that make sense? So you got 600,000 dying from this population and 200,000 joining. So that's like a decrement of 400,000 per year. So when you look across all of these years, there are actually 9 million fewer veterans in 2022 than there was in 2001. And when you calculate the rate, then you actually see suicide have gone up in the veteran population nearly every year for the past 2 decades. And I didn't show my work here, but I have it with me, I think, somewhere. A 64% increase in suicides from 2001 to 2022, which you wouldn't get from the way this data is presented. Okay. Now, I didn't calculate it for the US, but the US population has gone up, right? Number of suicides have gone up. The rate has also gone up, but not nearly as much as this graph would indicate. Okay. But it's still a major problem. All right. So this is, I don't want to minimize, but when you look to see this line here, you can see how you can graph it in a way that looks like it's flat as a pancake. All right. Well, that's pretty flat, isn't it? All right. It's got the contours of a pancake, in fact. All right. But when you actually look at the rates, numerator over denominator, right? It's a fraction. You can see that the rates have gone up about 64%. And I think that's really important because it speaks to the problem has been around for 2 decades and getting worse. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. Okay. So these are some facts. I try to get it all on one slide. Here's the rates again for the active duty. I just showed you the veteran. This is the active duty data. Again, it lags like everything else. And I just stuck in that little blue box the latest active duty suicide rate at 28.2. And you can see it's basically not changed from this slide here. All right. I try not to go get my own numbers. I try to use the official numbers in case anybody wants to quibble with them. I say, well, those are your numbers, not mine, right? So these are their numbers. But I just want to give you some facts here. 25% of all suicides occur within 2 years of the service member joining the Army or the military. Okay. Now, data from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan shows that about 25% of suicides happen after the service member returned home. Okay. They analyzed data like those who've never deployed versus those who deployed and saw no difference in suicide rates, so concluded that deploying doesn't increase risk of dying by suicide. But if you look at it this way, it clearly does increase risk of dying by suicide. And so these findings are not controversial. The interpretations are the controversy. I'm telling you, for those who asked, does deploying, does combat increase your risk of dying by suicide? I think the answer is absolutely yes, it does. Okay, but I can show you a set of statistics that says no, it doesn't. It's no different. But that's because they include this group, and I would argue it's a transition issue into a new culture. And you've confounded the causes, the risk factors. Okay, so that's this bullet here. 80 to 90% of active duty suicides occurred within 1 year of the service member seeing behavioral health. So this idea of get them to behavioral health and that will stop suicides. This data argues that that's not going to solve the problem. This is veterans. This was in that report that I just showed you earlier. 70% of elderly veterans, by the way, elderly veterans, not only in the US, but in the veteran population, comes and goes as a risk, for dying by suicide. Okay. But 70% of the elderly veterans actually had seen someone in behavioral health within 90 days of dying by suicide. Okay? So when someone says, oh, get them to mental health, get them to behavioral health, that's the solution. I'm showing you data that says in 2 different populations, an active duty population and a veteran population, that's not going to be the solution. Okay? And then we know the greatest risk of a veteran by suicide is within 18 to 24 months of leaving active duty. Again, transition. I argue it's a transition, and we should focus some kind of foreshadowing. We should focus our intervention efforts around these transition points. I have been arguing this for 15 years unsuccessfully. And I think it's because I'm not talking about it enough. So why I wanted to talk today, to get all of you who are interested, focusing on these transition points. And by the way, if anyone here studies sexual trauma and sexual assault, 85% of all sexual assaults in the military occur within the first 2 years of women joining the military. Transition points. Transition points are vulnerable points for a lot of folks. Okay, they're exciting, it's opportunities, you're transitioning, you're getting a new job, but you're also vulnerable. And so we can talk about that in maybe another presentations. Now, having said that, suicides are still fairly rare events. Okay. However, suicides are 3 times, someone is more likely to die by suicide, 3 times more likely to die by suicide than being murdered. How many of you knew that? You are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than be murdered by someone. How many knew that in the US? Murder rates have gone down, suicide rates are going up. I'm not showing you that data, I just thought that was an interesting fact. I talk about it in my military class. Now, suicides are rare events for a lot of reasons. I'm not going to go over all of these reasons, but people like to live even if their life isn't ideal. Okay, there's lots of reasons people live, and we just need to appreciate their rare events. And I will tell you, when I was on active duty, we argued for 5 years when we saw the rates going up, whether or not it was a real increase or whether or not it was normal fluctuation in suicide rates. For 5 years, we argued about that. It's not real, it's real. No, it's not real. Well, even if it's real, there's nothing we can do. Those kinds of arguments for 5 years. I was in the room, literally, when these arguments happened. They're so frustrating. Then after 5 years, okay, it's real. Then it takes another 5 years to figure out what to do, and then another 5 years to fund, so it takes a decade or two to actually address a problem once you've recognized it's a problem around rare events. So that's just the nature of that. This slide here is really a composite of findings from numerous CDC reports. CDC used to track, I hope they still do, I haven't checked lately, suicides in America, and they've done lots of risk and protective factors around suicide. I've collapsed like 3-ish reports, very long reports. I've read them, so you don't have to. This is my Rush Limbaugh limitation. Here's what they say the risk factors are: mental illness, medication, the same old suspects, right? Family history, availability of firearms, life experiences, physical illness, economic instability, legal criminal issues, the media and the internet. That's kind of the emerging one. Okay, that's like the emerging one. And these have been the same for decades. Now, I will say my very first suicide conference I went to was in Edinburgh, Scotland in 2008. Okay. Right at the early phases of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay. And this one talk, I'll never forget it because I know the person very well. We're very good friends now. He showed the risk, the mental health, the mental illness disorders associated with dying by suicide. And PTSD was not even on the list. So he hit this long list. Depression was up top, schizophrenia, right? PTSD, not even an issue. Okay. Now, I knew that the reason for that was because of a diagnosis issue. That PTSD, when did PTSD enter the DSM? Anyone? Any of my students online want to holler out the answer? What year was PTSD recognized as a mental health diagnosis? Anybody know? 1980. Okay, and when it came out, it was hugely controversial, especially in Europe, where they thought it was a made-up American mental health diagnosis. Okay, so there are very few people receiving the diagnosis of PTSD. So I think it was a diagnostic artifact. Of course, now you could look at a paper without showing PTSD being a risk factor. Okay, so I just point out when someone says a mental health disorder is not a risk factor, you got to look at the diagnosing behavior of the clinicians doing the diagnosing. That's just kind of an aside. I hope I don't run out of time from all these asides. So the military and the veteran, the VA approach to suicide prevention is I'm again summarizing all these bullets, but mostly it's all suicides are preventable. All suicides involve mental or behavioral health issues. In fact, there's a paper out there that says 90% of everyone who dies by suicide either has a mental health disorder or would have had one if they'd gone to mental health. Okay, never mind the details about how they determine that, but that's what everybody thinks. They all have a mental health issue. All suicides are preceded by warning, signs and symptoms. So the key is train everybody, recognizing signs and symptoms, and get to behavioral health. But I think I showed you getting people to behavioral health isn't going to end suicides, right? Suicides can be prevented through continuous training and awareness, focused on knowing the warning signs. The military does that every year at the same time for everyone, regardless of risk. Okay. All service members are at equal risk. I say they assume that because everybody gets the same training at the same time. We know that's not true. I just showed you some findings that when suicides happens, leaders, friends, or family members, or even behavioral health care providers fail to detect the signs a service member or veteran was under distress. If I can tell you the number of times that I've been on what's called epidemiological consultation teams, EpiCon teams, where we go to different installations where there's an outbreak of suicide. And the general is always mad because they've been to behavioral health and they're still dying by suicide. So he comes just blaming, you're blaming, what are you doing over there at that clinic? You should be helping these people, okay? And also behavioral health personnel, how to effectively treat and support a veteran who is suicidal. And our treatments are not that great. Now, having said that, our treatments are really not that great for any mental health disorder, but they're particularly not very good in suicide treatment. We're making progress. So this is not to say stop working, just means we need to do more work. Now, I want to say something about the contagion phenomenon or this copycat suicide. So this name comes from this novel by Van Gogh, where he glamorized, if you will, suicide. This book was actually banned in several European nations because they thought it was causing a suicide outbreak in Europe from people reading this novel. But, you know, Anna Karenina, there are lots of novels where the heroine or hero in the story dies by suicide. So there's guidelines for the media on how they should report deaths by suicide, particularly with children and adolescents, okay, to prevent the copycat. Now, I have suggested, and this may be why I've not invited anymore to some of these conferences, that training every year about suicide is creating a weather effect. It's normalizing dying by suicide. Okay, I don't have any evidence for that, other than the rates kept going up and they're really high and they haven't come down from all of that training. Okay, but think about how you normalize things that aren't facts by talking about them all the time, talking as they are facts. So if you start normalizing, if you talk about something all the time, then it becomes normal and it's no longer something that requires a lot of attention, because we're going to have an annual training on it, okay? Which I think is effective because it's getting everybody to behavioral health. All right, the evidence says this training's working. You're all getting to behavioral health. So, okay, there are two main models around the relationship of trauma, if you will, and dying by suicide. The first one is what's generally accepted as the pathway where you have this event, results in acute stress reaction that leads to PTSD, that then leads to depression, leads to suicidal ideation, and then death by suicide. I've argued there's this other pathway, the bottom one, where there's an event that leads to a moral or ethical violation that threatens one's sense of self and identity. Some call that maybe a moral injury that leads to suicidal ideation and dying by suicide. So two competing models, and I will tell you both models are not 100% correct, all right? It's like any model, there's probably some truth to both. I think there's more truth to this one than the top one. I'm not saying that I'm correct because, you know, it's a model. We know models are what? Not correct, all right? But the idea is to get us to think differently to move us forward. So this is how I define sense of self for those who are interested. I've adapted this from Amy Price's approach to sense of self. I really like the way she talks about it. But it's like this feeling good about yourself, striving to live a virtuous life, trying to be the best you can be, the best good part of you can be, knowing who you are despite personal failures and setbacks, so you don't let a setback, somebody, a partner dumping you, a partner cheating on you, running into financial issues, you don't think, oh my goodness, right? Remember all those risk factors I talked about earlier? Criminal behavior. Maintain a belief in yourself despite what others may say. The bullying you see on the internet. People telling you are worthless, right? Not listening to that. Now that's easier said than done, right? I always tell folks, I never take anything personally anyone says to me, even when it's meant to be personal. Okay? Took me a long time to get there. People can say whatever they want about me. I probably agree with 90% of what they would say about me, in fact. Yeah, okay, that describes me. All right, so, but it's not defining who you are by how other people define you. Okay, that's, and you can see there's a lot of stoicism in here, and I'll talk about stoicism. This, I think, probably why I like to this. So, these are threats to oneself, and you can see these are many of the risk factors that I showed earlier, but engaging in non-virtuous acts, legal issues, as an example, okay? Witnessing non-virtuous acts, serious ethical or legal violations, right? This is sort of what people think about moral injury. Personal rejection to being different, or awareness of self as being different. So LGBTQ individuals are at risk of dying by suicide. I would argue for that reason. Being self-aware that you're different, I think, is why suicide rates are so high among those who've been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Because people with schizophrenia do know they are different. And many of them don't like being different. Some people like being different. And that's a protective factor. All right? So don't take that away from people liking to be different. That's a protective factor. You want to build that in people, in fact, where they feel good about who they are, you know, sort of gay pride, black is beautiful, all of these slogans that build pride in your group and in you are, I think, protected. Perceived personal failures like financial issues, loss of employment, etc., betraying self or others, and then views of dying. Right? People have different views of dying. Right? Euthanasia, for example, assisted deaths. Okay, this is, I want to die with dignity, I want to run on my own terms, those kinds of things. So these are all potential threats to oneself. Now, I'm not going to go into the Stoics, but how many remember who Admiral Stockdale was? I know Suzanne probably does, because you have to be a certain age. He ran for vice president of the United States on a third-party ticket, okay? He was a Navy captain shot down during the Vietnam War. He was the longest held captive, POW, in Vietnam, okay? When he got out of captivity, they promoted him to Major General and awarded him the Congressional Medal of Honor. In his writings, he talks about while he was captive, he tried to take his own life, tried to die by suicide. And I got to wondering, I wonder if the military covered that up or not. So every Medal of Honor citation is on the internet. There's an internet website. You can go read every Medal of Honor citation. And And I said, I wonder if they mentioned it. And look at this. I took this straight from the citation. He deliberately inflicted a near mortal wound to his person in order to convince his captors of his willingness to give up his life rather than capitulate. He tried to die by suicide, right? How many reads that he's trying to die? They did not cover it up. They turned it into a virtue because it convinces. I don't think today it would make the citation, all right? But in 1976, it made the citation. Medal of Honor citation, you could read this. By the way, I had somebody fact check me while I was saying this. Well, yeah, it's in there. All right, I'm not making this up. I'm not clever enough to make this up. So, dying by suicide in some scenarios is considered a virtuous act. This is what the Stoics say about this, by the way. Okay? So, suicide literally means self-murder, right? He's taking your own life. So, what I was thinking, maybe suicide is choosing to die without honor. So there are ways to die without honor, there are ways to die with honor. Okay, so what I'm suggesting is we let the individual, we empower the individual. How many of you like that word empowerment? We use it all the time in social work, except when it comes to this topic. So here's how you die without honor. You try to escape responsibility, you punish those who left behind, you refuse to live a virtuous life, you succumb to short-term temporary setbacks, and you embrace vices as virtues. Okay, this is also how people define the decline of society when you embrace vices over virtues. So the Stoics said there are 5 reasons that it's okay to take your own life. When you're unbearable pain, this is sort of what the assisted dying is about. Useless or burden to society, principled reasons, indefensible cause, personal dignity, or to safeguard others. Okay, these are the 5 reasons the Stoics say. Now, there are counter arguments to all of this. I'm not going to present those. We'll let the rebuttal present those. So, there are numerous actions that involve dying with honor, that involve knowingly giving up your life. Now, every one of these acts would be exclusionary in the proposed DSM diagnosis for suicidal behavior disorder. All right, so even in the DSM, they acknowledge you may take your life for reasons that we don't want to call suicide. Okay, because, and mainly there's these religious reasons, like religious martyrs, Peter, John, even Jesus, right? Knowingly, at least in the Bible, says he knowingly went to his death. But, throwing yourself on a hand grenade to save your buddies, that gets you a Medal of Honor. Silver Star, get a medal for that, for bravery, for valor. Giving up your place on a lifeboat for the wounded, women, children, right? These are all things that get you awards for valor and heroism, for sacrifice. It's not called suicide. This is in line with what the Stoics were saying, okay? Now, of course, there's problems with this, and that is that someone killed themselves for no good reason. That all decisions are right decisions. We're all human beings, right? We're going to make mistakes. We're going to make mistakes. Yet the power of choice and the power of control is what the Stoics would say is powerful. That's the power. What we would say in social work, the empowerment. When you empower someone, does that mean they're always going to do the right thing? No, we hope they do, but they might not, because they're human beings and no one's perfect, okay? So what we have to do is acknowledge some things. So this is George Orwell, for those, I'm a big fan of George Orwell. But you have to acknowledge that the current approach to ending suicide is not working. I've been in this field for 40 years. We've been doing this approach for 40 years, and it hasn't solved the problem. And I know there's some people who just got to do more of what's not working. I'm not one of those. I think at some point you have to say we need a different approach. We need to embrace the fact that service members and veterans do have the power to decide how they live and how they die. Whether you like it or not, whether you trust them to make the right decisions or not, they do have the power. Know that every service member or veterans who's considered dying by suicide does not have a mental health disorder, although they would now if it gets into DSM-4, then by definition, everyone who tries to take their own life would have suicidal behavior disorder. Recognize that threats to one's sense of self contribute, at least contribute. Just concede me that it contributes. It's not the only cause, but it contributes to a veteran or service member's desire to die by suicide, except that many service members and veterans will experience dark moments. Now, what are these dark moments? So here are some of the dark moments that I talk about. They could be moral, physical, instrumental, criminal. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we can prepare people for these dark moments. Our suicide prevention training, I would argue, should focus on these things: building sense of self, and giving skills to manage and navigate dark moments. That's what the training should focus on. Building sense of self, building pride in oneself, belief in oneself, and how to manage dark moments. That's what I would say we need to do. Okay, this is just showing you the difference between the current model and what I would say the Stoic model. I'm not going to go into detail on these. And then change the narrative. Enable veterans to derive meaning from their service. Help people derive meaning from their lives, no matter where they're at in their life, no matter what they're doing. And let's abolish the blame game. I mentioned you're blaming someone. How come you didn't pick up on this? You know, as a therapist, if you have a client who dies by suicide, you better have good clinical notes, because they're going to be reviewed to see if you documented properly, that you asked about it, you ruled it out, or you're going to be in trouble, because it's the blame game, right? It's the blame game. Recognize dark moments as temporary setbacks. Tell people, these things happen to all of us. Doesn't mean you get out of responsibility, but we can overcome them, okay? Embrace diversity through rigorous cohesion building. I think this is the key. Everyone needs to feel they belong and they are wanted, okay? And this is where embracing diversity. And I say everyone should feel loved and accepted. I love you and I accept you. Not I love you, but I don't like you, right? That's a rejection, right? Right? It's love and acceptance. And develop a team approach. There's lots of players in this. The work that John Blosnick is doing is fabulous in this area, involving everybody, different people. Okay, so this is my last slide. I'm a little over time, but develop and validate next generation preventions. Double down on interventions that we know work. We know like means restriction works, means reduction works. Jennifer Lewis, Professor Lewis, doing some great work on gun safety. That's a form of means restriction, means reduction. Building nets under bridges that people jump off of. That's a means restriction. How many of you been to Europe? You see the subway platforms. You see some of the platforms will have the suicide. Not all of them, right? This is the paradox. So on this subway station, there's a suicide barrier that prevents people, but literally 2 minutes down the track, there is no barrier. People who are thinking of numbers won't even take the 2 minutes to go to the next track to jump in front of the train. Building time, no matter how brief, at least 2 minutes, we know saves lives. Okay? These interventions do not have to be like 2 minutes. It's like bridges. You know, I got involved in the suicide area when I was stationed in Germany. And a lot of people say, well, we need to just get rid of guns in America and that'll solve the problem. It won't solve the problem, okay? Service members who are stationed overseas can't have guns. So how do you think they die by suicide? Anyone. Kind of gave you the answer. How do you think they die by suicide? Train. That's how I got involved, because American service members are jumping in front of trains. Trains have a conductor. And what do you think the conductor? PTSD. Okay? So I brought in, now, were Germans jumping in front of trains? Yes, they were. But it's easier to have that conversation talking about American soldiers jumping in front of trains than it is for their own German fellow countrymen jumping in front of trains. But the lessons learned were equally applied. Okay? So and avoid the desire to act. Because accept that doing nothing is sometimes better than doing something that causes harm. And this is hard for social workers. It's hard for people in general. But if something can be beneficial, it can also be harmful. And if you don't know the harm that it can cause, then you don't know enough about the intervention to be doing it, I would argue. Okay? And then, be patient, but not complacent. Like I said, I've been in this specific area for over 40 years. We've gotten in some ways, because in 1985, when I first got into this area, suicides were at an all-time low in the military. Now they're at an all-time high. We've actually moved in the opposite direction. Okay, so I'm stopping there. Here's my contact if you want to email me some nice compliments. Or not. They don't have to be compliments, but I'd love to hear from you, because it's only from us working together and really fighting with these tough topics like suicide that we're actually going to get a solution. Thank you. I'm sorry for going over. So comments, or not sure how we're doing comments. I think you can just yell them out in the room if you want. I think there's mics everywhere, isn't there?
Yeah. So lots of applause online.
Oh, and the folks said, "Oh, thank you for the applause."
Yes, so we are open for questions on the floor as well as online.
And I'm happy to share all of these slides with anyone who wants them. Just email me and I'll happily send them to you. Or I can send them to Shinya and you can.
Yeah.
I won't burden you with it. Just email me and I'll send you the slides. Yes.
You talked about transition periods within the military, like especially within like the first 2 years and that 2-year being the transition. I'm curious what the average career in the military, generally speaking, would be.
7 years.
7 years?
6 point something, but I'm rounding up.
All out.
That's a great question. Well, I've never had that question, but I do look at that. How long do people normally stay in? So in the military, there's kind of like this halfway there. If you make it to 10, 90% stay to 20 to retirement.
Mm-hmm.
So you usually leave before the 10, because if you make it to 10, you usually, not always, but about 90% you stay to 20 full retirement.
Similar to marriage.
What's that?
Yeah. 7-year itch, really.
Yeah. We call it there the halfway there effect. And it's a real phenomenon. It's not nearly studied as much, I think, as it needs to be, because it would help people.
Mm-hmm.
What are you going to do in your next phase of your life?
Yeah.
And by the way, most people do leave.
Well, got a question online.
Oh, go ahead.
How does the rate of suicide in the U.S. Army compare to other militaries?
We're in the middle. In the middle. So we spend a lot of time, I would say wasted a lot of time, trying to figure out what other countries were doing. And it turns out no one has solved this problem. If you have a low suicide rate, it's usually because you have a more cohesive society. And it's usually a smaller country, but not always. For many, many years, Finland, which is a pretty small, it's a big country, but a small population, had one of the highest suicide rates in Europe. And they attributed that to, so Finland, as I understand it, I'm not a Finnish cultural expert, but as I understand it, have ready access to firearms like they do in the US, but they also drink a lot of hard liquor. And those two, and plus they rank very high on the loneliness measures as well. But it's come down quite a bit in Finland, and Russia was really high for many years, Latvia, Estonia. So it comes and goes, in terms of who's the highest. The US is usually in the center, middle of the pack, not the highest, not the lowest. And then there's a huge, you always have to do the age adjustment, because Europe tends to have older people, more older women. Older women are least likely to die by suicide. One of the lowest groups, older women.
Yeah, so Carl, my question was to what extent the suicide rate is a function of military culture that might be similar across different militaries as compared to the local country culture and the specific conditions of the country? That's my question.
Yeah, McCall, that's a great question. I know that in the US for many, many years, the suicide rate in the US military was lower than it was for the civilian society. And that was attributed to things like the healthy worker effect, because you can't join the military unless you have, if you have any mental health issue diagnoses, you can't join the military. If you have any physical illnesses, there's like hundreds of disqualifying mental and physical health issues where you can't serve. You have to graduate from high school. There's an age limit. So there are all of these variables that we said we have the healthy worker effect. And we took great pride in that in the military. But over time, I showed you how the rates were changing over time. In a couple of those years, the suicide rate was actually higher in the military than the non-military population. And it's now come down a little bit to be almost the same for the active duty. For veterans, veteran suicide rates are higher than the civilian suicide rates. It adjusted. I don't know if that answered your question, McCall, but it looks like suicide rates, at least in the US, are a reflection of society. Or, yeah, I'll say it that way.
Thank you.
But that's a great question. And it's looked at continuously.
So Carl, you mentioned in the beginning that transition is the time of vulnerability for people to more likely to take their life or the intention. Is the vulnerability during the transition time? Is there any specific research for this time? Like, do people feel less alone in this? Do they feel less support or something that could be a risk factor we could target?
So that I love that last bit about less belongingness. So a lot of people join the military to belong to something bigger than themselves, to be accepted. And oftentimes they're not accepted and they're rejected for who they are, for either their sexual identity or their sexual orientation, and that rejection is kind of for them the final straw, I would argue. It's why 25% of all suicides occur during that period of time where they're trying to meet new friends, reach out, and there's this rejection that sets in. That has not been studied to the extent it needs to be. We know from, I showed some data, or a finding, I didn't show the data, because I'd have to make my own graph, and I just didn't get around to doing that. But when soldiers come back from deployment, oftentimes that's for a different set of reasons. And usually it's around family and partner rejection. But again, it's around belonging.
Right.
But it's a different type of belonging. Because a lot of times when you're deployed for a year, in the US, we deployed for a year, a lot happens. Your spouse, your wife, your partner may find somebody else, and you come back and you're again rejected. Or you think, my marriage is terrible, but as soon as I get back, everything's going to be back the way it was, and it's not. So you see this again, vulnerable period. It's also, and I didn't show this data, 10%, 5 to 10% of all suicides in the US, this is non-military, occur in a mental health institution. You're actually in the hospital and you die by suicide. And we also know the most vulnerable point of dying is when you leave a mental health institution. Okay, that transition point. Why? Because I need to tell you whatever I need to tell you to get out. Okay? And that's what happens. And so even people who are looking at you can't predict what you're going to do. It's why I think we need a different approach. You need a fundamentally different.
And you're about to do a 2-year project on it.
I'm sorry, somebody said something?
And you're about to do a 2-year research project on it.
Well, we think, we always think we're gonna move the needle and, because I would wish there was no suicides ever. Okay, but I know that some people think that is the solution. And even though I'm all about empowerment and, a lot of people like, we're not gonna give you that kind of empowerment. Empowerment's conditional, right? I'm only gonna give you empowerment if you behave the way I want you to behave. That's not empowerment. I would argue that's something else. I wouldn't call it empowerment. But, just recognizing that one, it is a fairly rare event, but it's not 40,000 people a year in America die by suicide, as an example. It's not a small number, it's a big number in the aggregate. Thank you for that comment.
Chris, you got one more question.
Should I
So
look
there's
at
some
the
question
chat?
online said, in the research that was released in 2024, was problem gambling and compulsive gambling mentioned as one of the risk
What was taken?
factors?
What was that?
The 2024 research that shows problem gambling or compulsive gambling,
Oh, gambling.
mentioned, is that maybe in the context of risk factor?
Sometimes gambling is linked to financial difficulties. So when you look into how someone gets into financial difficulties, and this is not always, but not infrequently, gambling is involved in creating the financial difficulties. So I know that I kind of lump these into big categories. I know there's splitters and lumpers. I tend to be a lumper. It just helps me cognitively. But yeah, so think of gambling as a contributor to financial difficulties. And this is not an uncommon reason people take their lives, because they consider themselves a personal failure, especially in countries like America, where money and wealth is seen as success. So it's great question. These are all, by the way, these are all great questions.
Hey, any parting questions from our floor or online? Time's up.
There was a follow-up to the gambling question, which is there specific data available?
There is, but not current data. And I'm always hesitant to hold data that's too dated, because it won't be necessarily relevant to the current rates. Who's asking that? I can give you an older reference. It's the one that I'm thinking of is like 20 years old.
Why not?
Email me and I will get you that reference.
Okay. All right.
Okay,
so
well, thank you all very much
time's
for
up, so
coming.
thank you everyone for coming.